Hi, I'm Roger Himes, the Gospel Coach. This is another coaching session on the power of God's love. It's session number 13. Knowing God's love gives us boldness on the day of judgment, peace, and not fear. You ever thought about loving God? You ever thought about whether you could truly love Him or just maybe revere Him and hold Him in high regard? You know, if you're honest and think about it, from things I've said, it's really hard to love people who are above us. And this even includes God. You know, God is so far above us, we couldn't reach Him with a spaceship. Now, could we? You know, He's a God that keeps a little black book and sits in judgment upon us, as Paul says, and he says we must stand before the judgment seat of Christ. Now, we can respect God and pray to Him and look up to Him and try to please Him. We can worship Him and ask Him to forgive us. And even we can try to do things for Him to win His favor and blessing. We can ask Him to fulfill His Bible promises in our lives and ask Him for guidance and to show us His will. But it really is truly hard to love a God so vast, and as we picture it, so far above us. Now, this is really not the way God is, but it's sometimes the way we think. Paul says to have boldness in the day of judgment. First of all, during life, we're told to approach the throne of grace boldly to find strength and help in time of need. We're also told to have boldness in the final day of judgment, according to 1 John 4:17. Now, to approach God in this life and to be judged by Him should not be a fearful thing to us, according to the New Covenant Gospel. We should be able to stand before Him in perfect love and confidence in our hearts, and our hearts filled with His grace. We are totally accepted, forgiven, and loved by God. But because of our frailty and our shortcomings and weaknesses and sins, it's truly very hard to believe the unbelievable gospel. Yet we're told it's our job to trust God and believe the gospel. You know, Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden had a goal. In chapter 3, we're told that their goal was to become equal with God. Satan convinced them that God was holding back something from them and that He wanted to keep it only for Himself. And if they ate from the forbidden tree, their eyes would be opened and they'd become equal with God. Now, many preachers preach the same type of message, and we can be like God, we can live life just like Christ did. You know, that's really just human pride, guys. Only human pride says we can be like God. But the fact is, Jesus calls us His friends. In John, He says, I no longer call you servants, but friends. Now, this should be our first hint that we're really placed on the same equal level as God Himself. Jesus speaks so much of our oneness with God and with Himself. A friend is defined as a neighbor or an associate or someone equal to you and of the same nature as yourself. Hebrews tells us that Jesus became us. And for that reason, He could become our friends. John, in chapter 4, tells us that as Jesus is, so are we in this world. Now, of course, we know that Jesus and the Father are one, and that Jesus is God with a skin on, right? But He also made us equal with Himself. You know, we sometimes don't get this. The final prayer of Jesus to His Father in chapter 17 of John, He prayed to His Father and says that the very same glory that God had given Him, He gives to us. And He says His glory makes us one with them, even as He and the Father are one. Wow! Think about that. We're one with them. That means equality. He also says the Father loves us just as much as He loves Jesus. The motivation for everything God does is His incomprehensible love for us. Now, it's incomprehensible to us because we can't understand it. We can't grasp it with our human minds. So we must simply believe it because that's what the gospel says. And that's why we're called believers and not just understanders. Some things are hard for us to understand. Thinking of us on the same level of relationship with God that Jesus had is very hard for us. Now, also in John 17, Jesus says He wants us to be with Him where He is so that we can behold His glory, the same glory He's giving to us. Are we with Him where He is so we can properly perceive His glory? at least over there in our minds. Paul says God has raised us up and put us together in heavenly places, seated in heavenly places with Jesus. Ephesians 2:6. That's a pretty hard pill to swallow. It's pretty hard to see ourselves seated in heaven with God, with our feet still walking this earth, isn't it? Yet we're told to believe this is our spiritual position. And I know that every angel in heaven and every demon of hell sees us seated with our Abba Father God in heaven. Getting your head around this will change everything you believe about spiritual warfare. Now we're going to continue looking at what the gospel says about us being equal with God in the next coaching session. But in closing this one, don't try to put all this stuff off to the future, to heaven. The gospel doesn't mention the future in saying these things. Quite the contrary, in John 17:20, Jesus says he's praying for us to receive what he prays for because we believe in him through his written word. That's talking about us right here on earth today, not sometime in heaven. Hey, I'm Roger Himes, the Gospel Coach, and thanks a lot for listening.